November 2015. A seaman returns home unannounced after years at sea, arms full of gifts and promises. His wife should be overjoyed. Instead, she notices something unsettling. The coldness in his touch, the phone he guards obsessively, and a vacation that will shatter everything she believed about loyalty and love. This is a story about betrayal, hidden in plain sight, and one woman's calculated path to justice. I'm bringing you a case from Dagupan, Philippines, that reveals how far deception can go, and how far someone will go to reclaim their dignity. Marvin Molina's homecoming should have been a celebration. After years working international maritime routes, he arrived at his family's doorstep in Dagupan, Pangasinan, with no warning. Just a tricycle pulling up with luggage overflowing with gifts from abroad. His wife, Bernadette, and their 10-year-old child rushed to greet him, though Bernadette's joy was tempered by confusion. The remittances had stopped weeks earlier without explanation, and now here he was, all smiles and surprises. That first night, Marvin organized a neighborhood gathering, showcasing his success as a merchant seaman. Neighbors praised him as a dedicated husband and father. But Bernadette felt something fundamentally wrong. His hand in hers lacked warmth. The familiar tenderness she'd known during previous reunions had vanished. The signs accumulated slowly. Marvin remained perpetually attached to his phone, guarding it through meals and family time, his attention consumed by someone unseen. Bernadette initially dismissed her observations, attributing his behavior to work stress or perhaps planning another surprise. She chose to focus on an upcoming distraction. Her close friend and comadre, Geneva Bernardino, was visiting from Manila. Geneva had been like a sister to Bernadette for years, someone she trusted implicitly. When Geneva proposed a family vacation to Bolinao, one of Pangasinan's coastal destinations, Bernadette welcomed the opportunity for relaxation. In February 2016, they set out together. Marvin, Bernadette, their child, Geneva, and Geneva's elementary-aged niece. The beach initially delivered on its promise. Pristine sand, clear waters, children playing freely while the adults arranged meals and captured photographs. Everything appeared perfectly normal, the kind of family memories people treasure. But Bernadette's investigative instincts, dormant until now, began awakening. She noticed peculiarities in how Marvin interacted with Geneva, volunteering eagerly to photograph her, conversing with unusual familiarity. Then came the discovery that changed everything: Geneva's tattoo. While swimming, Bernadette glimpsed an intricate design on Geneva's back. A heart, intertwined with a sailboat, identical to the tattoo on Marvin's arm. Marvin had always characterized his tattoo as a professional symbol, representing his maritime career. Seeing the matching design on Geneva transformed Bernadette's suspicions into certainty. She observed them more carefully, noting secret glances, quick smiles, and body language, suggesting intimacy far exceeding appropriate boundaries between in-laws. That realization should have been devastating enough. What Bernadette witnessed next, however, would fuel her determination for justice. Late into the night, while everyone else appeared to be sleeping soundly, Bernadette lay wide awake. Her heart pounded with a mixture of dread and determination. The matching tattoos haunted her thoughts. What were the odds of such an identical, intimate design being coincidental? Around 2 in the morning, she heard movement. Marvin carefully rose from their bed, his footsteps deliberately quiet, clearly attempting to avoid detection. He left their room without a backward glance, phone in hand, moving with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to deception. Bernadette made a split-second decision that would validate her worst fears. She silently followed him through the darkened rental property, maintaining enough distance to remain undetected. Within minutes, another door opened, Geneva's room. Her supposed friend, her supposed friend emerged and walked in the same direction Marvin had gone, toward the shoreline. What Bernadette witnessed next behind the large rocks near the water would become the turning point of this entire case. Marvin and Geneva stood close together, hands intertwined, and then began kissing with the familiarity of established lovers, not people engaged in a spontaneous encounter. This was clearly a relationship with history, comfort, and routine. The emotional impact on Bernadette was profound, yet she demonstrated remarkable restraint. Instead of confronting them immediately or creating a scene that would traumatize her child, she returned quietly to her room. She spent the remainder of that night processing the betrayal, tears flowing silently, rage building methodically. This wasn't just about her husband's infidelity. It was about her closest friend's ultimate violation of trust. By morning, Bernadette had composed herself enough to announce she felt unwell and needed to return home early. Both Marvin and Geneva protested, citing the children's enjoyment, insisting she was overreacting. Their eagerness for her to leave became transparent in hindsight. They wanted more time together without supervision. Bernadette agreed to return alone, leaving her child in what she presented as Marvin's care, though she now understood their true motivations. During that solitary journey home, she cried continuously. But something else was crystallizing in her mind. A comprehensive plan for justice. Rather than react emotionally, Bernadette began operating strategically. She studied investigative techniques, documented everything meticulously, and most importantly, maintained absolute normalcy around Marvin. She smiled during meals, engaged in conversations, and gave no indication that her entire world had shattered. Her opportunity came when Marvin left his phone unattended during a shower. Bernadette worked quickly, heart racing, hands trembling as she accessed his messages. What she discovered exceeded even her darkest expectations. The affair with Geneva dated back 3 years, long before this vacation, encompassing multiple visits when Marvin returned to the Philippines. The messages revealed detailed planning of their encounters, explicit exchanges, and photographs documenting their relationship. More devastatingly, Bernadette discovered that Marvin's surprise homecoming had actually been orchestrated to spend extended time with Geneva in Manila hotels, while Bernadette and their child waited unknowingly at home. But Geneva wasn't alone. The phone contained evidence of multiple other women, encounters in various port cities, relationships with women in different countries, casual affairs in bars across his maritime routes. Each voyage apparently brought new romantic entanglements. Marvin had constructed an entire parallel life, treating his marriage as merely one compartment in a much larger pattern of deception. Bernadette also found the conversation where Marvin and Geneva had gotten their matching tattoos 2 years earlier, the heart and sailboat symbolizing their special connection. The professional symbol Marvin had proudly displayed was actually a mark of infidelity. Her hands shaking, Bernadette photographed everything, every message, every photograph, every conversation thread. She feared Marvin would emerge from the bathroom and catch her, but she persisted, understanding these screenshots would become her ammunition. With damning evidence secured, Bernadette shifted from victim to strategist. She understood that emotional reactions wouldn't protect her child's future or secure justice. Only calculated, methodical planning would achieve those goals. Her next move was consulting an attorney, someone who could transform her evidence into legal leverage. The lawyer reviewed everything: the messages spanning 3 years, the photographs, the proof of Marvin's extensive infidelities. In the Philippines, Bernadette had grounds for a concubinage case, a criminal charge applicable when a married man maintains a mistress in scandalous circumstances. Additionally, the emotional and psychological harm qualified under the Violence Against Women and Their Children Act. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. But Bernadette wasn't satisfied with just criminal charges. She wanted to ensure her child's financial security and prevent Marvin from manipulating their assets during the legal proceedings. Under her attorney's guidance, she began what can only be described as a brilliantly executed financial protection campaign. First, she systematically transferred funds from their joint bank account to a separate account held by a trusted individual, moving money in amounts small enough to avoid immediate detection. Marvin, still believing his deception remained undiscovered, paid no attention to these transactions. Next came the property transfers. The land they'd accumulated during Marvin's years as a seaman, purchased with his earnings but legally considered conjugal property, was quietly transferred into their child's name. Philippine law allows such transfers for minors under specific circumstances, and Bernadette ensured every document was properly executed. The vehicle registered in both their names presented another opportunity. Bernadette told Marvin she wanted to sell it to purchase a newer model, a reasonable explanation he accepted without suspicion. Once sold, the proceeds went directly into her secured account, completely outside Marvin's reach. Each move was deliberate, legally sound, and designed to protect her child's inheritance from a man who had squandered family resources on extramarital affairs. Bernadette was essentially building a fortress around her child's future, while Marvin remained oblivious, still maintaining his double life. By October 2016, everything was positioned perfectly. Bernadette filed criminal complaints for concubinage against both Marvin and Geneva, accompanied by the Violence Against Women and Their Children Act charges. The legal documents, supported by irrefutable digital evidence, were submitted to the courts. When Marvin received the subpoena, his reaction was predictable: shock, followed by denial and deflection. He claimed Bernadette had fabricated everything, that she was the problem in their marriage, that her jealousy had driven her to false accusations. He attempted to portray himself as the aggrieved party. Geneva, named as co-respondent, initially displayed similar bravado. She actually claimed in early proceedings that she deserved Marvin's love more than Bernadette did, a statement that revealed both her callousness and her fundamental misunderstanding of her legal vulnerability. Their confidence evaporated as the evidence mounted during preliminary hearings. The screenshots, the photographs, the documented timeline of their affair, the matching tattoos, the hotel receipts. Everything Bernadette had collected formed an unassailable narrative of systematic betrayal. Simultaneously, Bernadette filed for legal separation, which Marvin eagerly signed, likely believing he could finally be with Geneva without complications. What he didn't realize was that his signature came too late to protect any of their assets. The moment Marvin reviewed the financial disclosures required during separation proceedings, reality crashed down upon him. The joint accounts were empty. The properties were no longer in his name. The vehicle was sold. Years of earnings, accumulated specifically to provide security for his family, had been legally repositioned beyond his control, protected for the child he'd betrayed. The courtroom became a theater of consequences where Marvin's carefully constructed facade completely disintegrated. Each hearing revealed another layer of his deception, and his desperation grew increasingly visible. There were moments when he raised his voice in court, attempting to intimidate or manipulate the proceedings. Other times, he resorted to pleading, trying to appeal to Bernadette's sympathy or the judge's mercy. None of it mattered. The evidence spoke with clarity that no amount of emotional performance could overcome. One particularly devastating moment occurred when Marvin attempted to approach their child during a court session, seeking an embrace, perhaps hoping to demonstrate his paternal connection. The child's response was unequivocal, pulling away, running toward Bernadette, tears streaming and verbally expressing anger and rejection toward the father. That scene, witnessed by court officials and documented in proceedings, illustrated the collateral damage of Marvin's choices. He hadn't just betrayed his wife, He'd fractured his relationship with his child, possibly irreparably. Geneva's position deteriorated similarly. Her initial arrogance, the claims that she was more deserving of Marvin's affection, transformed into recognition of her legal jeopardy. As someone who had engaged in a relationship with a married man, fully aware of his family situation, she faced serious criminal liability under Philippine law. Her confidence evaporated as she realized the case against her was substantial, and her defense options were limited. Meanwhile, Bernadette endured her own challenges outside the courtroom. Marvin's family launched a campaign of character assassination, describing her as materialistic, deceptive, and ultimately responsible for destroying their son's life. The accusations ranged from claiming she was a demanding wife to suggesting she had driven Marvin into Geneva's arms through her behavior. These attacks came from multiple directions: whispered conversations in their community, confrontations outside court proceedings, and attempts to pressure mutual acquaintances into taking sides. For someone who had already experienced profound betrayal, these secondary wounds could have been devastating. Instead, Bernadette found strength in each insult. Every attempt to shame her became fuel for her determination. She understood something fundamental. People who defend indefensible behavior often resort to attacking the person who exposed it. Their criticism validated that she was threatening a system that had enabled Marvin's deception. Throughout the legal process, Bernadette also executed another strategic move that would have permanent consequences for Marvin's career. Working with her attorney, she filed formal complaints with government maritime agencies and international maritime organizations, documenting his conduct and requesting he be placed on industry blacklists. This wasn't vindictive, it was protective. Marvin's pattern of behavior in port cities around the world, his use of family resources to fund affairs, and his fundamental dishonesty raised legitimate questions about his character and reliability. Maritime employment requires trustworthiness, and Bernadette ensured that relevant authorities understood exactly who they were dealing with. The impact was devastating for Marvin professionally. Even after serving any potential sentence, he would be unable to return to sea work. The career he had built over years, the profession he had once taken pride in, was permanently foreclosed. The very job that had enabled his lifestyle of deception would no longer be available to him. In March 2017, the judge delivered the final ruling. Marvin received a 10-year prison sentence for concubinage and violations under the Violence Against Women and Their Children Act. Geneva received 6 years for her role as a participant in the extramarital relationship. The sentencing marked the end of legal proceedings, but the beginning of lasting consequences for everyone involved. Marvin's 10-year sentence meant more than incarceration. It represented the complete dismantling of the life he'd constructed. The man who had once commanded respect as a successful merchant seaman, who had been praised by neighbors as a model husband and father, now faced a decade behind bars for his own choices. His professional reputation, built over years of maritime service, was irreversibly destroyed. The blacklisting by government agencies and international maritime organizations ensured that even post-incarceration, he could never return to the career that had defined him. Ships that once relied on his labor would never hire him again. The oceans he'd traversed for years had become permanently off-limits. Beyond freedom and career, Marvin lost something perhaps more valuable: his family. The child who once ran to greet him now rejected him entirely. Years of absence, explained as necessary for providing financial security, were recontextualized as opportunities for betrayal. Every gift, every remittance, every promise had been tainted by the revelation of what else he'd been doing during those trips abroad. Geneva's 6-year sentence carried its own particular devastation. The woman who had once been Bernadette's closest confidant, trusted as family, celebrated as a cherished friend, was now publicly identified as a homewrecker, Her reputation in her community was destroyed. The shame extended to her family, who had to contend with the social stigma of her actions. That matching tattoo, the heart and sailboat that had once symbolized secret love, became a permanent mark of infamy. For 6 years in prison, and likely for the rest of her life, that tattoo would serve as a visible reminder of the family she helped destroy, and the consequences of her choices. Unlike Marvin, whose tattoo blended with his maritime background, Geneva's ink was now inextricably linked to a criminal conviction. The irony wasn't lost on observers. The very symbol meant to represent their special connection became the evidence that helped convict them both. For Bernadette, the outcome represented vindication, but not victory in the traditional sense. She hadn't emerged from this situation unscathed. The emotional trauma of discovering her husband's extensive infidelities, the betrayal by someone she considered a sister, and the public nature of the legal battle had exacted their toll. However, Bernadette had achieved something critically important. She had protected her dignity and secured her child's future. The financial assets she'd strategically repositioned meant her child would have educational opportunities, stability, and resources despite Marvin's absence. The legal recognition of the harm done to them validated their experience and held perpetrators accountable. Perhaps most significantly, Bernadette had demonstrated a path forward for others in similar situations. Rather than accepting betrayal passively or reacting with unproductive rage, she had channeled her pain into strategic action. She documented evidence meticulously, consulted legal professionals, protected assets proactively, and pursued justice through established legal channels. Her story resonated particularly within communities where infidelity might be quietly tolerated, or where women might feel powerless against unfaithful partners. Bernadette proved that with careful planning, legal knowledge, and unwavering determination, accountability was achievable. The case also highlighted important aspects of Philippine law that protect families, and particularly women, from exploitation within marriages. The concubinage statutes and the Violence Against Women and Their Children Act provided legal frameworks for addressing not just physical harm, but emotional and psychological abuse as well. As we reflect on this case from Dagupan, several profound lessons emerge. Lessons that extend far beyond one family's experience with betrayal and justice. First, let's discuss the psychological dimensions of long-term deception. Marvin wasn't engaging in a momentary lapse of judgment or a single impulsive mistake. The evidence revealed a systematic pattern spanning at least 3 years with Geneva, plus numerous other relationships across multiple countries. This represents what psychologists call compartmentalization, the ability to maintain entirely separate lives, complete with different behavioral patterns, emotional connections, and moral frameworks. Individuals who successfully maintain such deceptions often display specific personality traits: exceptional ability to manage conflicting narratives, comfort with sustained dishonesty, and sometimes narcissistic tendencies that allow them to rationalize harm to others. Marvin's shock when consequences arrived suggests he genuinely believed he could indefinitely maintain these separate worlds without collision. The matching tattoos provide a fascinating psychological element. In relationship psychology, permanent symbols like tattoos serve multiple functions. They create tangible connection, demonstrate commitment, and provide physical evidence of a bond. For individuals in secret relationships, such symbols can feel especially significant, a way of making real something that exists in shadows. That these same symbols became legal evidence illustrates how perpetrators often create their own documentation. Bernadette's response pattern is equally instructive from a psychological perspective. Rather than immediately confronting the situation, which might have provided emotional release but tactical disadvantage, She employed what's known as strategic emotional regulation. She experienced the full range of appropriate responses: shock, grief, anger, betrayal. However, she channeled these emotions into constructive action rather than reactive behavior. This approach required extraordinary discipline. Maintaining normalcy around Marvin while secretly gathering evidence and consulting attorneys demanded constant emotional management. Research on betrayal trauma suggests this strategic approach, while difficult, often produces better long-term outcomes than immediate confrontation, particularly when children and financial security are involved. The financial protection strategies Bernadette employed deserve specific attention. In many jurisdictions, including the Philippines, conjugal property laws mean that assets acquired during marriage belong to both spouses. However, these same laws often contain provisions protecting children's interests and allowing asset transfers under specific circumstances. Bernadette's systematic approach, transferring funds gradually, repositioning property titles into her child's name, liquidating joint assets, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of family law. Critically, everything she did was legal. She didn't steal or hide assets. She utilized legitimate legal mechanisms to protect her child's inheritance from being depleted by someone who had demonstrated financial irresponsibility through funding extramarital affairs. This is an important distinction. Bernadette wasn't engaging in deceptive behavior equivalent to Marvin's. She was protecting vulnerable parties, herself and her child, from someone whose actions had demonstrated he couldn't be trusted with family resources. Courts recognized this distinction, which is why her asset protection strategies survived legal scrutiny. The role of technology in this case cannot be overlooked. Marvin's phone contained the complete archive of his deception: messages, photographs, location data, communication patterns. In contemporary infidelity cases, digital evidence has become primary rather than circumstantial. Text messages provide timestamps, context, and often explicit admissions that would have been impossible to obtain in previous generations. However, this raises important questions about privacy, digital security, and evidence collection. Bernadette accessed Marvin's phone without his knowledge. In some jurisdictions, this might create legal complications. Philippine courts accepted this evidence, partly because it documented ongoing harm and criminal behavior, and partly because spousal access to shared devices falls into complex legal territory. The consequences of Marvin and Geneva's actions extended far beyond the courtroom sentences, creating ripples that affected entire family networks and community structures. Let's examine these broader impacts and what they reveal about the social architecture surrounding infidelity and justice. Marvin's extended family, his parents, siblings, and relatives, faced their own reckoning. Their initial response was defensive, attacking Bernadette's character and attempting to reframe the narrative. This reaction pattern is remarkably common in infidelity cases. Family members often experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension between their existing beliefs about a loved one and contradictory evidence of that person's behavior. Rather than accepting that someone they trusted was capable of sustained deception, they attempted to restructure the narrative by blaming the victim. This defense mechanism protected them from confronting painful truths, but ultimately isolated them further. Their attacks on Bernadette alienated community members who recognized the injustice, creating social divisions that likely persisted long after the trial concluded. Geneva's family experienced a different but equally devastating impact. Unlike Marvin's relatives, who could claim ignorance of his actions, Geneva's conviction carried explicit social shame. In many cultures, including Philippine society, a woman's participation in extramarital affairs generates particular stigma, often more severe than judgment directed at male participants. This double standard, while problematic from an equity perspective, nonetheless created additional consequences for Geneva and her family. Her relatives had to navigate community interactions, knowing their family name was now associated with homewrecking and criminal conviction. Family gatherings, religious services, neighborhood interactions, all became potential sources of judgment and whispered conversations. This social ostracism represents an informal punishment that operates alongside formal legal penalties. The child at the center of this situation deserves particular consideration. At 10 years old, when the betrayal was discovered, this young person was old enough to understand what had occurred, but lacked the emotional development to fully process such complex adult failures. The courtroom rejection of Marvin, the child pulling away and running to Bernadette, represented a profound rupture in the parent-child bond. Developmental psychology research indicates that children who witness or experience parental betrayal often struggle with trust formation in their own future relationships. They may develop hypervigilance around loyalty, difficulty with vulnerability, or conversely, acceptance of relationship dysfunction as normal. Bernadette's decision to pursue justice, while necessary, also meant her child would grow up knowing intimate details of their father's infidelity and criminal conviction. However, Bernadette's actions also provided important modeling. The child witnessed a parent refusing to accept mistreatment, methodically pursuing accountability, and prioritizing their well-being. These lessons, that betrayal has consequences, that legal systems can provide justice, that strategic planning matters, may ultimately prove protective even amid the trauma. The community response to this case also reveals interesting social dynamics. Initially, Marvin enjoyed reputation as a successful provider and devoted family man. His status as an overseas worker, a common and often celebrated role in Philippine society, granted him particular respect. These workers sacrifice proximity to family to provide financial security, and communities generally view them with admiration. Marvin's exposure as someone who exploited this distance to conduct multiple affairs challenged community assumptions about overseas workers. It prompted uncomfortable questions. How many others might be doing similar things? Can families trust partners who are geographically distant for extended periods? Does financial provision excuse other failures? These conversations likely made other overseas workers uncomfortable, potentially subjecting them to increased suspicion from spouses or community members. Marvin's actions thus created collateral damage, even among people uninvolved in his specific case. As we close this case from Dagupan, it's worth considering what makes Bernadette's story resonate so powerfully, and what universal truths it illuminates about betrayal, justice, and human resilience. At its core, this isn't simply a story about infidelity. It's about the collision between appearance and reality. Marvin presented himself as the ideal provider, working dangerous jobs far from home, sending money regularly, returning with gifts and stories. The community saw dedication. Bernadette experienced coldness. That disconnect between public performance and private truth is where deception thrives. The matching tattoos serve as a perfect metaphor for this case. Symbols meant to represent love and connection instead became evidence in a criminal trial. The sailboat that Marvin claimed represented his profession actually marked his betrayal. This transformation, from romantic symbol to prosecutorial evidence, captures how truth eventually surfaces, often through the very mechanisms perpetrators use to reinforce their deceptions. Bernadette's methodical response offers a template that differs markedly from revenge-driven reactions we often see in true crime narratives. She didn't resort to violence, public humiliation, or destructive behavior. Instead, she documented evidence, consulted professionals, protected assets legally, and utilized established justice systems. Her approach was surgical rather than explosive, and ultimately far more effective. This strategic restraint required remarkable emotional control. She maintained normalcy while secretly building her case, smiled at dinner while planning legal action, and protected her child from immediate trauma while ensuring long-term security. These choices reflect sophisticated understanding of how systems work and what outcomes matter most. The legal framework in the Philippines, particularly the concubinage statutes and Violence Against Women and Their Children Act, provided Bernadette with tools that might not exist in other jurisdictions. This case illustrates how legal systems can either enable or obstruct justice for betrayed spouses, and why understanding available legal protections matters enormously. For Geneva, the consequences extended beyond imprisonment. Her role as the trusted friend who became the betrayer added layers of treachery that purely external affairs lack. She didn't just participate in Marvin's deception, she weaponized Bernadette's trust, attended family gatherings while conducting a secret relationship, and even joined the vacation where her affair was discovered. That level of duplicity generated its own particular stigma. What happened to Marvin and Geneva after their sentences? That information isn't publicly available, which is perhaps fitting. They fade from this narrative because they're no longer the point. The story belongs to Bernadette and what she represents. The possibility of reclaiming power after profound betrayal. The ocean that once provided Marvin's livelihood became, ironically, the setting where his deceptions unraveled. That beach in Bolinao, meant to be a family vacation destination, became instead the location of discovery and the beginning of accountability. Bernadette lost her marriage but retained something more valuable: her dignity, her financial security, and her child's future. She transformed victimhood into agency, pain into purpose, and betrayal into justice. That's the story from Dagupan. Sometimes justice takes years. Sometimes it requires strategic patience rather than immediate confrontation. And sometimes the evidence of deception comes from the very symbols meant to celebrate it.